So, you're interested in gaming together with your friends. You want to sit on a couch together and actually interact with each other while playing video games. I think that's super cool. As a modern gamer, a trend that I've noticed is that as the gaming industry focuses more and more on their online multiplayer components, they've shifted their goals away from making a quality experience that you can play over and over with your friends online and enjoy to an experience mainly focused on extracting as much money as possible from their player bases. Not as much fun as it used to be. So in a world where this is the case and it doesn't seem to be changing, how are modern gamers like us supposed to cope? The answer for some lies in the past. The 6th and 5th generation of consoles include recognizable systems such as the PlayStation 2 and 3, the original Xbox and 360, the Nintendo Wii, and the GameCube. These consoles all hold libraries of games that offer an excellent era in gaming history. Specifically for the 5th generation, online functionality was in its early stages of implementation, meaning that games had to survive and thrive on merits other than how good their online multiplayer offerings were, because some people at this time in history didn't even have internet connections, let alone ones fast enough to support online gaming. Some of the best titles for gaming with your friends in person exist in these generations, and while emulation has made great strides, it has its own drawbacks compared to owning the physical hardware. Nothing beats just showing up to your friend's house or having them come over, handing them a controller, and getting right into gaming. With all this said, the goal of this video is to show you guys how to tear down, maintain, and modify these consoles so that you can keep the fun times going well into the future while the gaming market continues to dig its own grave. While I'd love to show you guys how to do this for all 6 consoles in one video, there's no way I could go as in-depth as I'd like to in one of these everything videos with that many subjects. So for now, we're going to pick one to take a look at. Today, we're going to look at the PlayStation 3. So the very first thing to discuss when talking about the PlayStation 3 is that there are multiple different models of the PlayStation 3 that you could possibly pick up. So which one is the best? Well, I'm missing one. I have a PlayStation 3 Fat and a PlayStation 3 SuperSlim. In between here, there would go another console called the Slim, which I'll throw a picture of up. And this console is probably considered the best. Now, within all these consoles, there are certain models to avoid. The Fats, for example, the launch model by some is considered to be the holy grail, but it also requires the most maintenance and is the most likely to have failed because of its high nanometer CPU and GPU. Basically, the long story short is they killed themselves through heat death way more frequently than some of the later revisions, such as this other model Fat and the SuperSlim here. But the SuperSlim, for example, it can't be hacked with custom firmware. You have to use a process called HEN. So, you know, it depends on what you're after. A lot of people would say that the Slim is the best option between the SuperSlim and the PlayStation 3 Fats, but I personally enjoy the aesthetic of the Fat. I do have some footage of me tearing down and restoring this SuperSlim as well, so we'll probably take a look at both. But needless to say, do your own research. I'm going to have links and resources down below in the description so that you guys can check out which model seems to be the best fit for you out of the available options for the PlayStation 3. I will be linking guides on how to tear down all 3 consoles. So with that in hand and with the examples you're going to see of me tearing down this Fat and this SuperSlim, you should be able to get a good idea of what you're in for as far as difficulty is concerned.
How's it going? You doing okay?
Alright, so basically it goes like this. First things first. If you haven't checked to see if your PlayStation even turns on and boots, now would be a great time to do so before expending all the effort we're going to need to put in to get it running right. Once that's confirmed good, we need to strip down the PS3, be it Fat, Slim, or SuperSlim, down to its motherboard and plastic parts for washing later. There's nothing in these consoles that can't be conquered by a good multi-bit set with a complement of Phillips and security Torx heads, until you get to the processors, but we'll get to that later. Once the plastic is off, there are some model-specific things to keep an eye on. For the SuperSlim, we're going to want to grease the door works when it's ready to be reassembled. I just use a tub of simple bearing grease that you can get at any hardware store. For the Fats, it's more about mitigating problems with the main board. Now that the teardown is completed, dusting along the way, we want to address the thermal solutions for our console. Replacing any tired 1mm or any other size thermal pads and repasting chips are our main goals, along with giving the fan a good dusting and any other parts that need it. However, in the case of the Fat, this is easier said than done. You see, the thermal solution for many, if not all, PS3 models is flawed. You see, Sony used standard desktop thermal compounds in place of the more desirable and traditional indium solder seen on desktop CPUs between the heat spreader and the actual CPU dies. Not particularly good compounds at that. Now that the consoles are over a decade old, it's well past time that we replace that compound. As compound ages, it dries out, losing its thermal conductivity, and worse, cracks, breaking contact with the actual chips, and therefore even more conductivity. But the real problem in the PS3's case is getting to where you need to replace it. The paste between the heat sinks and the heat spreaders is easy enough to get to, but the stuff that is under the heat spreaders is encased in glues and epoxies. I'm not gonna lie, this is a risky process. No console I've worked on for this issue has gone unscathed. One even lies dead from the attempt. But without getting in there, you're still facing a death clock. If you're comfortable with the potential risk, you're going to need some tools to do the job right. To start with, the most important tool is patience. This job took me a whole day off, plus an evening after work. This is slow is fast work, so if you're planning on rushing through and getting this done in an hour or two, it ain't gonna happen. The next tools you're going to need to do this job successfully would be a craft knife set, an angled painter's knife set, kind of a specific thing, but I'll try to include a link in the description, a hot air station or heat gun, a broad flathead, a hammer, and some nail polish is a good thing to keep around for remasking if you slip up with the craft knife set. The first thing we need to do is try to remove as much of the silicon sealant we see around the CPU as possible. This chip is known as the cell chip. This chip is sealed almost the whole way around with silicon sealant. The most important thing to know is that without the painter's knife, don't even think about attempting to get underneath the cell heat spreader. The craft knife set will dig into the substrate of the cell CPU well before getting to the glue underneath, due to the angle of attack you have access to with a straight tool like a craft knife. This is where these painter's knives come in. Once you've cleared all you can get at with the craft knife, the angled handle and dulled blades of the painter's knives will allow you to slip easily underneath the corners of the cell. And from that point, you can easily slice the remaining silicone glue. A little heat from a heat gun or a hot air station goes a long way here. I shoot for around 190 C while working on the PS3. You wouldn't want to go so hot as to potentially melt the solder of components on the substrate of the CPUs or any surrounding components. So that's one chip down. And if you thought that process was unnerving, did you know that less than 3% of my viewers are subscribed? Yeah, no one asked, but a like if this video helped you out would go a long way, so thank you very much. Anyway, more unnerving than that, the Reality Engine, or GPU. You're going to need a broad flathead, a hammer, and a heat gun, or a hot air rework station, not to mention a steady hand. So our goal is to break the epoxy on the memory chips of the Reality Engine, or GPU. Usually the craft knife is of no help here. However, checking to see if there is an accessible layer of solid white epoxy on top of the chips on the four corners of the package underneath the heat spreader is usually a good idea. Since you can potentially slice it repeatedly and slowly if it is present, if it's not there for you like it wasn't for me on my second attempt, I'll show you what to do. This is where you gotta get brave with hot air, a hammer, and a flathead. I heated the heat spreader up to around 190 C 5 times, each time letting it cool back down to room temperature in between. The exact temperature isn't so important. We're trying to heat cycle that epoxy to get it ready for what happens next. You'll need to identify which side of the RE chip has no exposed components on the GPU substrate. You can use a flashlight to look underneath the heat spreader to find it. From there, heat the heat spreader one more time. Insert your flathead, preferably with something covering the tool edge. I used Captain tape. Then whack it a few times, firmly, but not too harshly, with a hammer. Rinse and repeat until the spreader pops away from the RE chip. So yeah, this right here is very dangerous. It's totally possible to nick the die, destroy the substrate, knock the RE chip right off its pads, rip the top layers off the memory modules, and more, so do this at your own risk for sure. From here, I made some decisions on scavenging the beefier coolers from my dead CECHH for this new CECHL, and taking the CECHL's higher blade count fan over the one in the CECHH. I also cleaned up all the old thermal compounds, scratched away all the remaining silicon and thermal epoxy from the CPUs and the GPUs, respectively, as well as their heat spreaders, before total reassembly with clean parts. Freshly washed from the shower. And of course, I applied fresh paste and pads happily where they belong. So with all that, the hardware work is almost done. Now it's time to talk upgrades. Not much can be done to upgrade the PlayStation 3 other than better cooling, and a larger hard drive. The PS3 only natively supports around 1.75 terabytes. There are conflicting numbers on this on the internet, but since they don't make drives at that size, it's effectively capped at only 1 terabyte disks. You can use SSDs as well, but the advantage will be nil on the PS3's anemic SATA 1 interface. With all that said, I purchased a 2 terabyte Samsung 870 EVO for this project well before I realized this through further research. Thankfully, I had a 1 terabyte spinner in my laptop that was happy to be swapped with that SSD. With that said, it's time to get to the part where we restore the PS3 with hybrid firmware and finally exploit the thing. A link to the latest available hybrid firmware version will be linked below, as well as a guide you can follow along for running all the required exploits. In our case, because we installed a brand new unallocated disk, the PS3 is going to revert to recovery mode and require us to supply a dashboard update over USB. In order to do this successfully, we will provide the system with a FAT32 formatted USB stick that contains the hybrid 4.90 firmware in the rightmost USB slot, and then follow the on-screen prompts to restore that update. It might take some experimentation to find a USB stick that works properly with the PS3. I had to run through about 2 or 3 of them before it found one that it actually could read the files from. Now with that done, we should be in the dashboard. I'll let my live self guide us through the custom firmware install process. A link to the custom firmware that I installed will also be in the description.
So for our next stage, we're going to need to dump our NOR flash. Now it's NOR because of the console revision I'm on, but you'll want to check your console revision to make sure that you have NAND or NOR flash. Earlier consoles use NAND, later consoles use NOR. So at this point, we're going to basically be relying on internet-hosted toolkits. Now, if, in the future, if these toolkits fall off the internet for whatever reason, there are self-hostable options within this same guide that I am linking that you can basically host a web server yourself to run these exploits. However, for, ease of flow of the video, we're not going to cover that in this one. Maybe we might do a separate video on that later. But for now, we are basically going to just run through the motions and use the internet-provided toolkits. So from this point, we need to basically First thing we have to do is set up our web browser. So from here, we need to adjust our home page. We need to just use a blank page. That's step 1. From there, I'm just hitting triangle, by the way, to access this menu. From there, we need to delete basically everything in the web browser. So we're going to start with our cookies. Bring it up again. Get rid of our search history. Basically, we just want the browser to be fresh. Then the cache. And finally, the authentication information. Okay, perfect. Now from here, we have to basically go to a certain web page. So from here, the web page we need to access is HTTPS. And hopefully this should work. I have connected my Ethernet cable. I have not configured internet, and it looks like it has. Click here to continue. Just guiding. Okay, select flash dumping device. Yeah, sure. And we have a NOR-based console. Successfully found all variable offsets. Great. Okay, well, we'll run checks next. And then from here, it should dump a file called flash490.p3t. There it is. And it should be dumping that to our flash drive as we speak. And now that that's done, we can close our prompt. And then once this is ready, we should be able to dump flash memory. So this would be the point where you would definitely want to be doing this on a battery-backed circuit. Great. Dump flash. Perfect. So eventually this will display dump operation successful, and we'll be ready to move. So that took about 10 solid straight minutes, but as you can see, we have a dump operation successful. So this is pretty much where we're done messing with the PlayStation 3 as it stands before the final preparation here. Okay, so when you initially plug in your flash drive, it might give you some warnings asking you to format it, or a warning like this telling you that the disk is not accessible. Simply ignore those warnings. And we should still be able to access the disk. Here it is, and as you can see, PS3 flash dump .bin. We need to take this and drop it into PS3 checker. Drop that in PS3. And then from here, we're going to bring it into PS3 tools. From here into the standalone package. And then we've got drag and drop your dump here.bat. So we'll take our dump right here, drop it here. And it's going to run through and verify that our dump is good. So at this point, now that we know our dump is good, we can patch our flash memory. So this is the riskiest process involved, and I'm going to take you back over to the PS3 to view it. So back on the PS3, we can now patch our flash memory. This will take time, and this is where we are very power sensitive. We do not want anything to go wrong while we're patching our flash memory, otherwise we could brick our console. It doesn't take nearly as long to patch the ROM as it does to dump the ROM. As we can see, the patch operation is now successful. So now we can reboot the PlayStation 3 and install any custom firmware we like. So basically, to get that started, we're going to need to take a look at our flash drive. So we'll go back over to Sony. So for the next step, we need to remove our original hybrid firmware. We can do that by deleting our PS3 folder on our flash drive. Now we're going to need to copy our dump and make sure it's in a safe place. I do already have it here and inside the PS3 tools master, so it's already good. So as far as custom firmware goes, I am going to use EvilNat Cobra. It was released very recently and should serve all of our possible goals. So yeah, that'll work for me. I'm just going to copy that PS3 folder over to the flash drive and simply perform a reboot, turning off the system, turning it back on. Alright, so now we've loaded the system, and we're ready to go to the update folder. And we should be able to go to System Update, Update via Storage, and there it is, EvilNat PAX. Alright. Alright, the system went to a black screen. I waited another good 5 minutes before doing anything. I left it just sitting at that screen. After 5 minutes of inactivity, I decided it would be a good idea to flip the power switch on the back and flip it back on and turn it on again, basically do a boot cycle. And now it's in this screen where it's installing a system update. So the results, I'm not sure what the results of this progress bar will be, but hopefully it will be the proper custom firmware. This part is not in the guide by any means, so I'm not sure exactly what your results will be, depending, I'm sure it might depend on what custom firmware you're attempting to install. So it might be restarting. So that's basically it, guys. From here, you know, you can install basically any kind of homebrew software that you'd like.
Alright guys, so what are some easy takeaways from this experience? Obviously, I think the PlayStation 3 is probably one of the hardest consoles to service, especially the Fats. Once you get into the Slims and the Super Slims, for example, I know in the Super Slim, like I showed earlier, The GPU reality engine is delidded from the factory, so it's a lot easier to maintain that particular system. There might also be other limitations that you didn't foresee. For example, my drive situation. Turns out 2 terabytes is too much for the PlayStation 3. It will not read something like this without a crazy modification. But yeah, hopefully this teardown gave you a rough idea of what you can expect when you're modifying your own.